From the Cube studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from the Cube and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
More than 8 years into the modern era of AI, the industry has moved past the awe and shock of Gen AI 1.0. The novelty is gone, and in its place is scrutiny. Enterprises are less impressed by demos, and they're somewhat more impatient about outcomes. And market watchers like us, we're increasingly skeptical about kind of vague narratives. And the commentary has shifted from, look what AI can do, to show me the money, give me visibility, and give me control. Now, this dynamic is backstopped by our central premise that the linchpin of AI is data, and specifically data in context. The modern data stack of the 2010s, i.e. cloud-centric separation of compute and storage, pipelines, dashboards, etc., now feels trivial. The target has moved to enabling agentic systems that can act, coordinate, and learn across enterprises that have a mess of structured, unstructured data, complex workflows, conflicting policies, different identities, and the nuanced semantics that live inside business processes. The industry remains excited and at the same time conflicted. And to tap an oft-cited baseball analogy, the first inning was academic discovery in and around 2017. There were papers explaining transformers and things like diffusion models, and nobody's really paying attention. But the second inning was the ChatGPT moment and the AI heard around the world, which has brought excitement and plenty of hype. Welcome to the third inning of the modern AI era, and welcome back to this week's theCUBE Research Insights powered by ETR. In this special breaking analysis, we assess the shift from the shock of what is this Gen AI thing to how do we make it work for us? And how can we get agents to reliably take action to deliver the productivity gains that the tech industry has promised us? And to do so, we're pleased to host our 5th annual Data Predictions Power Panel with collaborators from the CUBE Collective, members of the Data Gang, and some of the industry's leading analysts. With us today are 5 industry experts that focus on data and related topics. Sanjeev Mohan of Sanjmo, Tony Baer of DB Insight, Dave Menninger of ISG Research, Kevin Petrie of BARC, and Andrew Brust of Blue Badge Insights. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello, Dave.
Hey,
Dave. Good to see you again.
I'll get it out of the way. Aren't there any women in data?
I thought about that too. Yeah,
we're going to get the heat, but so we got at least acknowledge.
We need work.
Okay,
We'll get there. We'll get there.
As our tradition is, before we get into it, we want to share some survey data from our friends at ETR, just to underscore how much the industry is changing. These guys do quarterly spending intention surveys of around 1,700 IT decision makers. I want to isolate just on the ML AI space for a moment and show you how things have changed. This graphic here shows the spending by sector. They cover about 19 sectors. The vertical axis, as you might remember, is net score, which is a measure of spending momentum within the sector, and the horizontal axis is pervasion or penetration into those 1,700 accounts within the data set. So if we go back to here, we show like back to April 2024, we show some squiggly lines, but that red line at 40%, anything above that indicates highly elevated spending velocity. And if you didn't know it already, MLAI stands above all sectors, despite, a little deceleration that you can see there in the spending. Now, perhaps the tapering in momentum is an indication that we still need better AI. A Workday survey this week showed that 85% of respondents said AI saved between 1 to 7 hours a week, but you guys will be able to relate to this. More than a third of that time savings is lost to correcting errors, rewriting, verifying content, and only 14% reported consistently positive outcomes from AI. Nonetheless, the ETR data is showing steady progress over the last 6 months. Let's take a look. When asked how they're leveraging AI, more than 1,700 customers continue to cite productivity, decision support, and business transformation as the leading benefits, with gradual increases in citations for each of those. But look at the meaningful uptick since last July in future headcount avoidance. It moves from 21% of the sample in midsummer to 30% today. Pretty notable. Finally, let's look at some of the players in the mix. You guys will love this. We're going to talk about some of them today. It's the same dimension, spending velocity on the Y and account penetration on the X-axis, but some notable changes. And we put a chart into the lower right corner so you can see how the dots are plotted, net score and against the number of ends and responses in the survey. Remember, anything above that dotted line, red dotted line, is highly elevated momentum. OpenAI and Microsoft, despite some recent negative sentiment, they remain in a leadership position on both axes. Look at Meta's Llama. It's done a nosedive. It was the number one momentum player. Now it's well below the red line. And meanwhile, Anthropic is thriving with their enterprise focus and their focus on coding. AWS and Google are still on top of each other, but as we've reported in the past, Google is closing the gap on AWS in this sector. Snowflake wasn't even on the radar 2 years ago. Now it and Databricks are on top of each other. Databricks has more momentum. Doesn't surprise you, but Snowflake has higher count penetration, slightly anyway. Ignore TensorFlow. It's not a vendor, but they track that. But you can see that in the lower left, a bunch of legacy players bunched up, and they're, frankly, fighting for relevance in the market. So the point is, the industry continues to shift right before our eyes, and customers have to squint through all this noise, and they got to place bets amidst all the chaos. So hopefully, guys, that gives you some background. We can refer back to that, but let's get into the predictions. Thanks for staying with me here. Okay, this next graphic shows all of the 2025 data gain predictions for each analyst in the table. So it shows the prediction and a self-analyst rating. I've rated for the analysts that aren't here on whether the prediction was a direct hit, which is green, a glancing blow, which is yellow, or a miss, which is red. So a quick scan of the heat map shows that Data Gang had a mixed performance last year in its 25 predictions. And now each of our analysts is going to review and you can kind of decide for yourselves on the rating. So Sanjeev, why don't you pick it up from there?
Yes, sounds good. Thank you so much, Dave, and happy to be back for the 5th year. Last year, I had predicted the rise of AI agents and the proliferation of AI agents. The reason why I find it mixed is because depending upon who you talk to, you get different answers. It's a very nuanced piece because to some extent, the number of agents over proliferated, everybody rebranded, everyone now has an agent doing all kinds of things. But the story is not complete because single task agents, I would say some of them are doing an amazing job coding. Claude, I think CTO said 100% of Claude's new additions have been done by Claude Code, which is phenomenal. So, but that's coding. And then we see customer service and a few other ones. But the idea that I have where agents are embedded in a complex workflow and autonomously are working and making decisions, we are not there yet. And the other thing I also said was next year when we talk, all of us will have personal agents. I still think the technology is a bit difficult for mainstreaming of agents. And so that'll have to wait for another year.
Okay, thank you for that. Guys, bring that same slide back up. And Tony, why don't you pick up your prediction from last year, Renaissance of Data. You gave yourself a yellow, but explain your thinking here, please.
Yeah, I predicted Renaissance of Data basically on the premise that with all the attention to AI was going to need good data. So therefore, it was going to direct a new spotlight on data that basically both vendors and customers would really basically be redirecting their focus. And I wasn't necessarily expecting, this wasn't going to be the year of 2010, so we have new data startups. There's just more attention to it. And so I gave myself a yellow because if you look at it just from the standpoint of vendor announcements, it certainly was a big year for data. I don't think, basically front and center was Model Context Protocol, MCP. There wouldn't have been such a rapid sort of, coalescing of the industry around this, around a protocol, basically a framework that was announced like maybe, it was very late in 2024. And within a year, it became a de facto industry standard. And it's become now an open source project that's under the Linux Foundation. So that was pretty amazing. It shows that basically the industry realizes the importance of connecting to data and having a standard way of doing that. In turn, Postgres had a really good year. We saw 3 new, basically Postgres platform entries. Starting with, for instance, what I'll call Snowflake and Databricks, each bought at the same time their own Postgres platforms to essentially complement their analytic platforms. And it could be said that one of the prime use cases was to basically, it's kind of like a state, a state repository or a state store, for agents, storing for agents state, and persistence. Microsoft, same thing, basically with Horizon DB. We also saw Apache Iceberg really become, firmly entrenched as a de facto standard that even Databricks this past year put it as now a preferred platform. It's on equal footing with Delta, and we've seen some interesting things. Vectors, of course, have become basically checkbox features, table stakes. We start to see language models start to help, not just being used with the database, but help manage the database. And we've seen also in that term, starting to see some database agents, for managing operations.
So why the yellow, Tony? Why the yellow?
Well,
it sounds like you crushed it.
I'll tell you why, because the world is not just vendor announcements. And part of this was also that customers would really rise to the occasion. And it's not that customers are not realizing the importance of it, but the fact is that data and AI governance are still largely siloed. So we're still practicing a lot of the same, we're still seeing a lot of the same old practices. So that was a little bit disappointing. Also, knowledge graphs, which I expected were going to be really big last year. I've not seen a whole heck of a lot of adoption there. I think I've seen a lot of talk, but but not as much adoption as I would have expected. And there was an interesting study that AWS released that I think kind of backs this up, which is that 40% of chief data officers still cite problems, these perennial problems with data quality and data integration. We're still fighting these same old battles. So that's why I didn't want to basically just give us a pat in the back and declare victory and go home. I want to be realistic here.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, speaking of knowledge graphs, you bring that back up, that same graph. I did Carl Olson, retired, so he's not here. He predicted the rise of knowledge graphs. I'm like a knowledge graph fanboy, and so I gave him a green. Now, Tony, you just sort of threw cold water on that. I can't remember. I apologize, guys. It was either Kevin or Andrew. One of you guys had data that suggested that the adoption of knowledge graphs from enterprises was sort of flat. I wonder who was that, and can you kind of pick up from there?
Sure, that was me. We have BARC research coming out from my colleagues Sean and Merv just last month that showed if you look at adoption of knowledge graphs as of late 2025 compared to early 2024, we found among AI adopters about 27% had knowledge graphs in production compared to 26% a year and a half earlier. So fair uptick, but what went down was evaluations and POCs. So I think that the pipeline of development or implementation for knowledge graphs has slowed. And that's a surprise to me too, because I think knowledge graphs have a lot of value to offer. There is complexity in terms of the assembly and the preparation of inputs for those knowledge graphs, and I think that's one of the gating factors.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. So I'm going to go back and give that a yellow-green. We'll revisit that in the final. Dave Menninger next, if you can, if you bring that same slide back up, I appreciate it. Dave, LLMs to lambs, explain what you meant. Why red, yellow? Tough grader here.
Yep. So I'm going to pick up on a theme that Sanjeev was talking about, and that is the notion of complex agents and coordinating the actions between agents. And so last year I highlighted the deficiency in LLMs, which was that they were good at generating text, but not good at planning and executing a series of tasks. And so I predicted another class of models would emerge called large action models. Well, the lambs went to slaughter, but the fundamental premise was correct. So the fact that the lambs went to slaughter is the red part. The yellow part is we did need to address those issues. They got addressed in a different way. The LLMs, needed to be supplemented with additional capabilities, but rather than a separate category of models, the mainstream models were extended with reasoning and task orchestration capabilities, including the ability to follow goals and constraints, as well as supporting techniques such as chain of thought prompting and tree of thought searches to evaluate multiple options. So the issue was real. The solution ended up being a different solution than what I had predicted. So give myself a red and a yellow.
Great. Well, thank you, David. And guys, one more, if you bring that same slide back up and anybody wants to chime in here. This is from Brad Shimon, who said he threw a bunch of cold water on our whole session last year when he talked about security being the buzzkill. I think maybe, Andrew, you're going to pick up on that this year's prediction. But, look, everybody's focused on security. It's a major issue. Security, governance, AI trust is sort of the top thing. Even Jamie Dimon, agrees with that security is the biggest challenge here. So we gave that a green. All right, guys, I appreciate you looking back on 2025, but let's get to the meat of our episode today and turn our attention to the 2026 predictions. So the way it'll work is the designated analyst is going to present his prediction, and then we'll have time for one or two other analysts to chime in on that assertion. Please do. Here's a table showing all of the predictions for 2026. They're all data related, or at least adjacent. Context, semantic layers, services as software, really interesting. Some skepticism on OpenAI and governance as a blocker. So lots of context from our experts to come. So let's dive in. Sanjeev, please, you first. Your prediction focuses on AI agents scaling, and you posit that there's a problem around context, a gap that exists. So please explain your thinking and elaborate on the evidence, and then Tony's going to follow up.
Yeah. So, Dave, when I started brainstorming what predictions I would put for 2026, my first prediction was this continuation of this unification story that we are seeing, and Snowflake bought Observe, for instance. So it's not just data, infrastructure. So that was my whole premise for this year. We'll see more consolidation, more M&As. But then, beginning of this year, there was a paper that got put on LinkedIn. The next $1 trillion opportunity is context graphs. And all of a sudden, LinkedIn blew up with context graphs. Everybody, every day, they're posting about it. So my prediction for 2026 is actually bipolar. And the reason I'm saying it's bipolar is because on one hand, I'm saying absolutely 100% we need context for these large language models, large action models to do their job and be successful. But I'm also predicting that in 2026, we will waste a whole year arguing, debating about context graphs, and we will not have it. And the reason I'm so strongly have strong opinions is because to me, this is a repeat of, let's say, data mesh, where the concept is great. We have a bottleneck. How do you get rid of that bottleneck? But there's no implementation. How do I know I have achieved context graph? Is there a standard? Is there a way to store stuff? And we don't have that. We don't know how to build it. We cannot agree on a definition. Today, when I look at the definition of context graphs, it's like super broadly defined. If I may take just 30 seconds, because if people are wondering what the heck is context, we already tried knowledge graphs, we've talked about knowledge graphs, we talked about, and Tony will talk about semantics. What is context? So typically what happens is, let's say I have all my data in a transactional system. I create a knowledge graph. I can very quickly traverse and find out who bought what and when. But what I'm missing and what an LLM would benefit from is a why. Why did they buy that product? Well, that is not in the transaction system. That is in the web search they did or in the logs. Maybe it's an email. Maybe they called support line. If you take all of that and you go and you relate it to your traditional data, you get a very rich context. And so that's my prediction is that we will just spend time arguing about context, and every company will jump into this. Everybody's going to have a context graph, but we won't be successful.
Well, thank you, Sanjeev. When we were prepping for this, Tony, you said this is right up my alley. So dig in.
Well, I'll give another minute. I'll give another metaphor there, which is, well, we just say, Sanjeev, you ignorant slut. But I think, no, the more operable metaphor really would be, Sanjeev, you're killing me soft with your song. And by that, context is very slippery in terms of how do we define this? What is this? It's kind of like, well, you almost, it's like the Supreme Court justices, definition of porn. I can't tell you what it is. I can just tell you what it is when I see it. That's why it really leads into basically the prediction that I'm going to be talking about, which I'll segue into in a second. But I think what I see and what Sanjeev is saying is kind of it sort of mirrors the same struggle that we've had over the past year with knowledge graphs, which is that it's trying to get our arms around essentially what is knowledge, and how do we structure it. Now we had on my podcast, and partner myself, Miles Hasley, had a great conversation with Sudhir Hasby over at Neo4j, formerly of Google, and he's been talking very much about that. And I said, Sudhir, how do we put this together? He said, you know something, we have AI that can kind of help guide us there. And so I think that there's some hope in terms of just like we can use, let's say, language models to help, introspect, a database and essentially spit out basically some ideas with regard to your schema, spit out ideas in terms of like how to index and all that type of thing. I think there's a role here for AI to help. But I fully agree with Sanjeev that essentially we are going to spend the year struggling to find just what context is.
Great. Okay. Go ahead, please. Somebody got a comment?
Yeah, Sanjeev's concern about we'll be spending a lot of time talking about it and not see so much implementation. I think that's astute and it's true. I think that applies to most things in AI. The debate is at one level and on one plane, and the actual implementation is quite different. And well, that in and of itself leads to issues and leads to probably failed projects, but it's not unusual. And it's going to be a continuing factor, I think, not just for knowledge graphs, but for most other things.
There's a debate going on right now on the Cube research. George Gilbert, on the one hand, is saying you got to have a knowledge graph, a 4D map of the enterprise, people, places, things, and processes, a digital representation of the enterprise. You got to do the work and build that up like Palantir is doing, and he cites Celonis a lot. The other end of the spectrum, one of our analysts emeritus, David Floyer, is like, it's too complicated. AI is going to have to solve for this. Yeah. Like Tony, you were just saying, AI can help us get there. So two completely different ends of the spectrum. It's going to be fun to see how that plays out. Is it a comment?
For 4D of building 4D of a business just sounds like an onerous task. We cannot even build 2D of a business. We don't even know what supply chain and inventory and finance. They have different meanings, different terminology. So yes, in theory we should, but how and what will it cost? Palantir is a super expensive business, right? So can everybody afford to bring Palantir? Palantir is killing it because of this ontology that they sell.
George has been a Palantir watcher for a long time.
Yeah, for sure. Forward deployed engineers are only $1 million a year. What are you talking about?
Oh, that's right.
Exactly.
Tony Bear, you're up next. We're gonna show your prediction here. Zeroes in, of course, on the all-important semantic layer. It's a complicated situation for many. Explain your thinking here, please.
But it's more doable, I think, than context in terms of, I think we know what semantics are. I mean, this has actually been, we've had this for decades, actually. And for those of you that might recall back to the almost 30 years ago, business objects with universe. It was, they had their semantics tier. What a semantics tier essentially was essentially a metrics store. Essentially, these are the metrics that you look at. And the idea was to avoid having to basically reinvent the wheel each time we wanted to do some reporting. What I'm looking at this year is that so I say semantics as it's a known quantity, but I also see it's also essentially it does go a good bit of the way. It doesn't do the whole job of helping to establish context. What my prediction is all about is like last year when I talked about data renaissance, it was about having good data. And what we found is having good data was not good enough. You witnessed that AWS survey, but having the right data. And so, having some context there. And I hate to use that C word again, but the challenge with AI compared to, let's say, BI with semantic layers is that with BI, you were drawing on it was a walled garden of data. You're going on from a database, or I should say, a data warehouse or a data mart. And so the context was kind of implicit in terms of it wouldn't be in there if it wasn't relevant to the problem you were solving, at least to the to the queries you were asking. Whereas with AI, since you're going outside of just walled gardens, context needs to be explicit. Now, again, as I said, and semantics is a step towards that. It's not the entire. It's not the entire battle, obviously. And so what I'm seeing here is I think there's going to be a renewed focus on semantic layers here, or metric stores. And essentially, if you think about it, as I said, talk about business objects with universe, in enterprise applications like the SAPs, the ServiceNows, the Salesforces of the world, Workdays, they've always had their semantics. The challenge has been that they jealously guarded just like their source code. And so what I'm looking at, and I've already seen a lot of evidence building over the past year, is that this is going to be a way that these vendors extend essentially their penetration, into the customer in the age of AI, in the age of where they also have to work with other systems. You look at what SAP has done, for instance, with harmonizing the data model across their entire portfolio of applications, which was not a slam dunk by any means, and packaging these all into what they call data products. And these data products are not, it's not like you can just export a data product from SAP, just like you can't go into their knowledge graph, but they will share it with you. In other words, that data product stays resident inside SAP. And that was the whole key to the SAP Databricks relationship that came last year. These are two fiercely independent companies.
So, Tony, you're bearing the lead. You should be talking about OSI.
Well, but we're gonna get to that because OSI.
How long do you need to get to it?
Gotcha.
Bearing the lead.
Well, the thing is that OSI is a response to all that. The fact
what is OSI? First,
okay, I was going to say Open Systems Interconnect, Open Semantics Interchange. Maybe we should call it OSI 2.0. And it's essentially, it's basically a framework so that basically I can define what a customer is, and you can interpret that that's what I mean, that my definition of customer can sync up to your definition of customer. It's based on a framework that DBT developed. Essentially, it's kind of like exposing a metric store. That's a reaction to all this. It wouldn't be happening if the fact that if there wasn't the reality that semantics is going to define effectively a lot of the context on which we're using AI. I'll add one other thing, which is that we are seeing some movement at the edges with regard to ontologies. I think it's kind of a natural, outgrowth of all this. But again, this will be the struggle that Sanjeev that you're referring to. But for instance, like what Microsoft is doing in Fabric IQ, very interesting stuff. But again, what I see this year is that that semantic spheres of influence are essentially solidifying. They're not just emerging; they're going to be solidifying, and it's going to be defining the way we use data and the way we use AI.
Interesting. So, thank you, Sanjeev, for cutting to the chase there. I wonder if AtScale is going to join OSI now that they got some dough from Snowflake. But
I think they actually just did. I spoke with them last week. Yeah.
But Dave Menninger, they're going to follow up with Tony. You buy that?
Well, I'm going to pick up on what Tony's saying and agree that semantic and context are critical to the success of AI projects. Our data and AI study shows that the number one data challenge organizations face is data usability for AI. And semantics and context are part of the issue. They're not the entire issue, but they're part of the issue. And Tony mentioned that there are efforts to address the semantics portion. Multiple vendors are claiming to support semantic models, and many of those vendors are starting to announce support for OSI. But nearly all of these efforts use SQL as the language for capturing semantics. And in my opinion, that's just not sufficient to express the business rules that are behind the way most businesses operate. And without a rich expression language, you can't provide all the context that are needed by these AI systems. So yes, semantics are becoming a popular investment We're making progress, but I still think we have a ways to go before we've solved the problem.
You know,
Dick,
first, please,
can I just
chime in.
chime in? I actually worked on a report on semantic layers. We first published it a year and a half ago. People thought I was a little nuts, but but to Tony's point about this being multiple decades in the making, that's true. I mean, what we're calling semantic models now are not all that different from what we used to call OLAP cubes the better part of 30 years ago. And there's a couple of reasons they work. One is that when you have a multitude of data sources coming in and a lot of ambiguity, the semantic layers act as an abstraction layer over that so that you have a single set of definitions and you don't let the large language model play fast and loose by interpreting all the different definitions that could apply. And LLMs have a bad habit of doing that. Unless you tell them exactly what's what, they kind of make up what's what. So, and it's a good baby step towards having full context, because I agree, right? Something invented for business intelligence, I think it does, Tony, go beyond metric stores. It's also about dimensions. It's also about categories. It's also about this is a product, this is a customer, this is an order. But that's not enough. You also need temporal stuff. You also need relationships, to Dave Menninger's point about SQL not being sufficient. But it's a good intermediate step that actually most customers haven't taken yet. And the ones that have are already ahead of the game for AI, even if they haven't even launched initiatives. They're in a better position than companies that haven't built semantic layers and gotten their semantic hygiene in place.
So history repeats, OLAP cubes, Cognos rebirth, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. All right. Dave Menninger is up next. This is a really interesting prediction, Dave. SaaS vendors get squeezed and services providers thrive. The professional services side of this prediction is contrarian. And we saw software take a hit in 2025 and continuing this year after Anthropic and Apple announcements just this past week. And David, when we went from on-prem to SaaS, everything changed. The operational model, the technical model, the business model, the licensing model, and it feels like we're on the cusp of a major change again. Please pick it up from there.
Sure. Well, you've heard all my colleagues talking about all the challenges we have. I mean, these are great advancements that we're making, but they take time. We're not there yet. But agentic AI is everywhere, right? And part of where it's appearing is in automating parts and usage of software platforms. So software vendors can embed agents into their products to do things or help you do things. And that's going pretty well. Those are being successful. But this notion of generic agent capabilities, doing anything you want in any type of an organization, that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. We have some data about 1,200 use cases, and AI systems in that survey are moving into production. We see about 32% of those 1,200 use cases are in production. And as a reference point, that's up from about 15% a year ago. But that means 2/3 are not in production. And part of the reason is all the things, we've been talking about on this session. I'll give you one of my perspectives. I think Andrew's going to pick up on this later a little bit. Only 17% of the several dozen vendors we rated in their AI platforms were rated A- or better in agent design tools. And only 11% were rated A- or better in agent evaluation tools. How can you build agents and deploy them if you don't have that basic tooling in place to be able to support those agents? So the bottom line is that commercial off-the-shelf tooling is not ready for prime time yet. Several of us were on a briefing earlier today, a vendor talking about their capabilities. Great plans, but they're just plans so far. They're not in the market yet. So agentic AI is all the rage. What are enterprises to do? Well, our research shows that custom tooling is the second most common tooling used for AI applications right now. And my colleagues at ISG have visibility into what global system integrators are doing. I look at software, they look at service providers. And what they're doing, we hear companies like SAP touting 150 agents, dual agents embedded into their business applications. That's great. But the GSIs that we meet with have developed hundreds and in many cases thousands of AI agents. There are varying degrees of complexity. Most are more focused, than a general purpose tool would have to be. And as a result, they're able to get them into production faster because they don't have to boil the ocean, right? They're focused on a specific problem. They can put bounds around it and they can get it out into the market and provide value to enterprise customers more quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And Kevin, you're going to follow up here. It's interesting. I think Bill Hurst coined the term service as software. But it's an interesting concept when you think about the labor intensity of the system integrators and then their ability to potentially scale without labor. It starts to get interesting. Kevin, what are your thoughts on Dave Menninger's prediction?
Yeah, I like Dave's assessment. I agree with it. I think that our research is showing that integration complexity is a major barrier to success with agentic workflows. A lot of organizations understand to get the real benefit and some competitive advantage, they want to start to bring functions together in multi-step agentic workflows. And that's tailor-made for SI assistants. It makes sense. We also have data showing some tailwinds at the back of consulting firms and SIs. We're seeing, and this is again Sean Rogers and Merv Adrian's report from earlier this year or late last year. There's higher satisfaction levels with external consulting firms than with internal IT departments. Not unprecedented, but I think reinforcing that SIs have a lot of value to add here.
I love how you guys bring the data, and I really appreciate that. Not just opinions without data are just that. And so thank you guys for sharing some of your research. Okay, we're going to stay with Kevin now. Kevin, you're calling for OpenAI to trip up. Another fun one. Guys, if we bring up the next prediction, it's a pretty brave, given that OpenAI is about to raise $100 billion on an $830 billion valuation. Kevin, don't you want in on that investment round? You don't want in. Why not? Let's hear.
I don't. I should say that I started my career as a financial journalist during the .com era, when a lot of assumptions about whether eyeballs mattered more than profits were proven unfounded. I think that techies and investors have a tendency during innovation booms to lose sight of risk. And I think that's probably happening here. As I said, during the 90s, there was a lot of investors and a lot of members of the tech industry assumed that eyeballs mattered more than profits. Just looking at human nature in 2005, a lot of retail investors thought collateralized debt obligations were a safe way to reduce risk to get into the mortgage industry. So there are a lot of cases where you need to rethink some of the fundamentals about risk. And you don't need an MBA to look at OpenAI, just the numbers, the proportion of the numbers, and start to be a little concerned. They've been a dazzling success, 700 million users. That's 8% of the globe are weekly active users. Wow. They've raised $60 billion, more than any private company ever. Now they want to raise another $100 billion, which is pretty brave on their part. That would be more than any company has raised on the public markets ever. But you start to look at, okay, what are they doing with the money? They probably had about $13 billion in revenue in 2025. Maybe the revenue run rate exiting 2025 was $20 billion, but the losses exceed that. In fact, from Microsoft's financials, the information and some other sources figure they lost $11 billion in Q3 alone. It could be that they're losing money on every inference task right now. So it could be that their operating margins are negative. That's speculative, but there are concerns about the cost. They've signed letters of intent to add $1.3 trillion of data center capacity to train super smart models that our data shows the industry isn't looking for. What practitioners want now is not AGI. What they want is data quality, integration assistance, and better trained workers. So I think that there's a lot of value and work to be done in AI that OpenAI is investing money elsewhere. OpenAI owes Oracle $300 billion, and arguably they need to convince they're raising money in order to pay their existing commitments, which is concerning. So all that's to say that I think that if you look at OpenAI compared to Google and Gemini, which has probably commensurate Gen AI model performance now. Google is paying for its investments with existing cash. They don't need to raise more money on the public markets. There's some question about OpenAI, in my view, about strategic indirection. They're making these massive bets on AGI, and they also want to learn how to build chips and partner with Broadcom to design and build chips. I would encourage them to draw a little more focus. If you look at Anthropic, they're from the start more focused on safety. They've had fewer safety blowups than OpenAI, and I think they have more strategic focus. They're likely to turn a profit, or they're predicting it in 2027, I believe, compared to 2029 for OpenAI. So all that's to say that if you're a data or AI leader, I would suggest asking some fundamental questions about what model vendors you want to invest in. If you ask basic questions about the stability of your vendor and your software investment, I would think that OpenAI is a much higher risk than others like Anthropic or Google. And it's important to think about that because the switching costs are rising. It's getting harder for practitioners to change Gen AI models. There's a lot of metadata associated with certain capabilities with a given model. There are various ways in which you need to build it into your governance architecture. So I think today and now, AI and data leaders should ask hard questions about whether OpenAI is the right commitment for them.
Yeah, we are in one of those moments where, I mean, there's no question that Sam Altman is out over his skis.
Yes.
It's one of two things happens. Either he's the next, Steve Jobs, or the whole thing blows up, and it's so fun to watch. Andrew, I know you have some thoughts on this. Please chime in.
Yeah, I have a few. First of all, a lot of the smart people I know are using Anthropic and Claude and finding it superior to the various models from OpenAI. And in fact, I know people who are using Claude Code for non-coding tasks. They're just kind of using it almost as their personal AI and their business AI. So there's definitely something to be said for kind of market positioning and so forth. On the other hand, all these providers, all these foundation model providers are leapfrogging each other every few months. So it's a little bit hard to pick a winner based on, where we are today. We kind of thought Google was way behind, and now Gemini is really enjoying a great status. I also think OpenAI has a first mover advantage, and I don't mean that in like a typical way, but what I'm thinking is a lot of people use it, right? It's like the Kleenex or the Google. It's the generic verb and the generic brand. My 16-year-old son told me that people just refer to GPT as chat. Oh, I looked it up in chat. So they have the generic going on, and there's a lot of shadow AI in a lot of enterprises, and a lot of the shadow AI is ChatGPT because people used it at home, people started with it, they're comfortable with it, and that may end up being a kind of influential thing later. Also, don't forget, like Amazon was losing money for a really long time. It just looked like nothing but a money pit. But their market share and their first mover advantage in a lot of different subsets of commerce served them well.
Yeah,
So-
but Andrew, I want to respond to that one because I think, especially when you bring it over to Amazon, it's an obvious, it's an obvious example.
Well, they both start with A.
That would be true. I very often tend to think that WeWork is probably the more
That's a good one too, actually.
The more apt analogy or metaphor. Thing is with Amazon, yes, eventually on the retail side they did become they did become basically revenue and margin positive. But where does Amazon get its real margins from? It's from AWS. What happened with Amazon is that they had an Act 2. And the thing is that without AWS, Amazon would just be a bigger Walmart.com. So I think we have to kind of keep that part in mind.
They built an adjacent business, but I think OpenAI has potential for that as well.
There is. I mean, they're trying to get into shopping, but I've also seen, for instance, that that with OpenAI they don't seem to have the same. They haven't figured out the shopping convenience yet. That's a skill that basically that they have to learn that Amazon already had. Google, from what I gather, seems to have a step up there in terms of making the commerce side a little more seamless. Obviously, these are things that can be overcome. The other question I have, though, with regard to we work interesting slip of the tongue with regard to OpenAI, is your son may be using it. Is he paying for it?
Yeah,
So let me tell you with a
I'm
little
paying
bit of
for
data.
it, but
interesting.
Yeah.
So we have some data from that 1,200 use cases. And I mentioned that custom tooling was the second most common tooling. Well, guess what? The first most common tooling was ChatGPT, right?
exactly.
And guess how far down the list Gemini and Claude were? They had about a third of the usage
Way down.
as OpenAI. So there's some real data that OpenAI is successful. Now, I'm not a financial analyst. I don't play one on TV. I'm not going to comment on the financial stability, but I'll say they're too big to fail.
So
Yeah.
Kevin's
That's a good
analysis-
point.
they're the default and the
interesting.
go-to for lots of people.
So Kevin's analysis, I think, was right on, very crisp. I think you could take both sides of this. I think, Andrew, what you were saying about Amazon and Tony, in a lot of ways, AWS, they kind of pulled it out of their, because of their culture, and they took huge risks. And I agree. I think OpenAI could, or they could explode and blow up in a bad way. But they've got to get to many hundreds of billions of dollars by early next decade. That's what this says they've got to do. If they have negative operating margins, I mean, that just they suggest they've got to get to 200, 300, 400 billion by early next decade.
I think Kevin's
mind-boggling.
I
think Kevin's point-
infrastructure is getting far better. Like what Vera Rubin was announced, the amount of infrastructure you would need to train and do inference would be going down. So it'll help actually OpenAI.
Exactly.
It will help, and also this tends to expand to fill the available space.
And
Kevin's
OpenAI
point that
has
they're losing money on inference is very astute, and I do think the cost of that is going to go way down, and it's gonna be a geometric progression, not merely.
And Sam has allocation from Jensen, I think ahead of Google, obviously with TPUs, and I would say ahead of Anthropic as well, because of their relationship with AWS. Elon, interestingly, was working on a chip for the data center and decided, no, that's not going to play out because Jensen's would crush me. So he's going to the edge. It's just so fascinating to watch. That's one of my favorite predictions, Kevin. So thanks for bringing that up. And we're going to stay with.
And I should just add real quick.
Yeah, please. You get the final word. It's your prediction.
Actually,
so the negative operating margins for inference, that is speculative. It's where I'm getting is from Ed Zitron, who's a commentator. I think he's known to be a bit of an AI skeptic, and he came out in November saying that his estimate was that their inference costs exceeded revenue to date for that year.
So it's very possible. I mean, it's not. Thank you for that clarification. All right,
like 2 months ago.
We're going to stay. We're going to stay with. We're going to stay with Andrew for the last prediction. I said last year Brad killed the buzz on AI with his security concerns. Andrew, you're kind of at least in the same area code with AI governance as a blocker to successful AI in 2026. Enterprise success stalls due to immature governance with some evidence that you cite. Kindly share your thinking here, please.
Yeah, and Brad can be a bit of an Eeyore, but I'm not above that myself. I think he was right. I think it's important to look at just kind of the basics, because enterprises have standards around the basics. And my prediction is that enterprise AI is going to stall this year, not because the models aren't ready, but because the governance isn't. And we're accelerating capability. We're going gangbusters, way faster than control. The problem is enterprises can't really tolerate that gap. So until we have controls around levels of autonomy, which everybody talks about for agents, we have approval workflows, and we have some kind of life cycle governance and the ability to actually test agents before we deploy them, then the productivity gains that everybody is talking about here today, including everything around semantics and context, that stays theoretical, because If these agents run rogue, and without controls, pretty much anything runs rogue. If they run rogue, they're gonna be deployed, and then they're gonna be rolled back because the liabilities are just gonna be too broad.
Thank you for that. Sanjeev, I know you have the follow-up here.
Yeah. So so I'm not an ER, probably more in Ralph Wiggum category from Simpsons. So, so there's no question. In fact, this has been an amazing podcast or webinar because we've talked about so many issues, model, OpenAI survivor, Dave mentioned tooling, not there. I think governance is a showstopper, no questions about it. But AI is like, it's flowing everywhere. You cannot stop it. And because you cannot stop it, businesses will find workarounds, or they'll pick use cases where there's less of a chance of embarrassing yourself and having some sort of a crisis. And I feel that we will start working out governance for the first time in the 3 years since ChatGPT has been out. This is a year when we will start seeing some progress in this space.
Dave mentioned a bunch of us were on a briefing with a major vendor earlier today. I won't name names, but they were talking specifically about a platform for agents. And I was the crank in the room who asked the governance questions. And I was congratulated on how good my questions were, and was told that they're thinking about all of the things that I brought up, and that they wish they had been, they aren't as far ahead as they'd like to be, but there's really nothing out there yet. So while that's the case, gravity is a thing. Enterprises don't deploy agents, they deploy systems of accountability. Yes. And until the vendors ship governance that matches that risk profile, adoption's going to lag no matter what. Even if they push stuff out there, there's gonna be that disillusionment, and they're gonna pull stuff back if these things can't be controlled in a disciplined way.
I want to pick up on Sanjeev's notion, right? I don't think that's going to stop deployments. Do you guys remember getting Christmas presents as kids, and on the box it said some assembly required?
Yeah,
that's where we are right now. Yeah, that's when I talk about governance. I try to encourage enterprises. You have to recognize that some assembly is required. You're not going to get this out into production without adding.
But you don't go to production until it's assembled.
So we are in third innings, as Dave Vellante said. So obviously we are too early in this game. And Andrew, the vendor that shall not be named is a legacy company. And if they say the market is not ready, how do they know? Are they in Silicon Valley watching all these startups that are doing some amazing work in AI governance? They're not. They don't even know. So
I think this is one of those things where you're actually both right. I had a conversation on theCUBE at Snowflake Summit with the chief architect of State Street, and he said, our mantra internally is move fast, but don't break things. And my prediction would be, we're going to keep moving fast and things are going to break. And so,
yeah. And that's the other thing also is that, agents, we only just started talking about them maybe like 18 months ago at most.
That's the truth. Yes.
And to expect that we're going to be at some sort of maturity stage at this point, I think that what I disagree with, and it's not anything that you folks said here, but it's like all these grand predictions of agentic transformation. Well, that's going to take a while, just like it's going to take a while for generative AI to essentially transform enterprises for the transformative effect. Doesn't mean that we're not going to be basically experimenting or basically doing it in some, let's say, low risk processes or very sort of basically guardrail, sort of very self-contained processes. I think you will see in certain very well defined self-contained processes, you will see agents. And for instance, like a data science, an agent for performing data science, you'll see special purpose. But yes, it's going to transform enterprises, not anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of our data is showing that 50% of adopters are in production with agents, and I personally think a good chunk of that is agentic features within existing software.
Yes,
I also think that
and Claude
more robust. It's going to be, and it's going to be any SIs, to build on David's point. It's going to be SIs and consulting firms that are going to help with the governance mess, because they'll have proven best practices for 10 of your peers in order to make sure you can do it right.
The SIs are picking up of where, let's say, the platform or the application vendors have left off.
Yes.
haven't gotten to yet.
That will lead to a patchwork architecture that could cause even more problems, again, because gravity's a thing.
It won't be without problems.
Sanjeev, you're right. That was a legacy company, and they live in the enterprise. Like most legacy companies, they have locked-in revenue from enterprise customers who, can't or won't get out for whatever reason. They have a ton of experience with regulated industries, and even they are focusing more on this performative dance around capability without sort of realizing that what goes up must come down. It's frightening. It
Well,
really
when you
is.
think about Kevin's prediction and his data, the financial analysis that he did, I know it was back to Apkin Kevin, and it wasn't necessarily yours, but the point being, if OpenAI is chasing consumer AGI, I believe, and I wonder if you guys agree, that the real opportunity is in the enterprise for the reasons that Andrew was just discussing.
Yes.
So
OpenAI has dropped. OpenAI has dropped. They're not chasing AGI anymore. They know.
well, exactly. And so I think they understand this, and they understand where the opportunity is. I think they got to get focused. I mean, they just said a couple of weeks ago, they said they're not doing ads, and they're going to, they did the code red, and now they announced they're doing ads. Although I suspect part of that is because a Google query, a search query is, fractions of a penny. An AI query is 100x that. And so OpenAI may be just trying to tweak Google because they can. So I think there's an interesting chess match going on there. But the point I wanted to ask you guys is, do you agree that the opportunity is in the enterprise, and because Claude is showing real ROI right now for coding? The question I have is, will 2026 be the year where we see similar productivity gains outside of that particular use case? And what's holding that back? Is it governance? Is it capability of the models? Is it all the surrounding tooling? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
So our data is showing that data quality went from number 6 or number 8, depending on how you counted it in terms of AI obstacles, to number 1 over the last year and a half. So data quality is a problem. Go figure, data people would say it for 30 years. But another big problem is people, training people, building the operating model for employees within an enterprise to use this stuff successfully. There are some surveys that are showing the average knowledge workers' usage of AI has gone down within enterprises.
Interesting.
And I think part of that is worry about job security, but lack of real focus and replicable processes.
So if we look at history, you look at Amazon. Amazon went from consumer to enterprise, Tony's point about AWS. And then you look at Google. Google went from consumer search to enterprise.
Yeah.
And even historically,
money in the
Microsoft
enterprise.
started consumer and went enterprise, right? In the 80s and the early 90s, Microsoft was going after the consumer, and that completely switched once they actually made their product secure.
Well, Google's got a long way to go if it wants to catch up to its consumer with its enterprise. I mean, its income statement is all search and advertising right now. But to your point,
enterprise is always the opportunity.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of every cycle, it's all about sizzle, and those are not enterprise considerations. But pretty soon the VC money runs out, real revenue has to come in, and that real revenue comes from enterprises. And you've got to have the boring stuff in place for enterprises to use you, because otherwise you're not reliable.
So this is an analogy I sometimes have in my mind. We know the modern era of AI took off with ChatGPT, right? So just like the modern era of the internet. So we all had been using internet for decades in IT, but the mainstreaming was with World Wide Web. And which company was the gatekeeper to that? Yahoo. So to me, OpenAI is having the Yahoo moment, but then we had Lycos, Alta Vista, Excite, all of these companies came in. But later on, this upstart called Google comes in.
Yeah, really the tail end of the boom.
So maybe Dave Vellante, you said we're in the third innings, in the fourth or fifth, there'll be a new company which will figure out this whole mixture of events and transform architecture and will basically wipe out these initial competition.
I think it was the late 90s when Google was founded.
Yeah,
Maybe in
right.
99.
I mean, their IPO was
Sanjeev.
2003. I want to say 2004.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
all right, guys.
Yeah.
Awesome conversation. I got to go. And I'm sure you do too. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all the insights.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
That's great.
And thanks to our friends at ETR for sharing their data. And thanks for watching. And we'll see you next time on Breaking Analysis.